this story. But I'm going to close in this last minute with one last image. And this image is not from my own real experience, but actually this is an image taken from the book by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And in that image, she presents racism as a conveyor belt on which people are just living their ordinary lives, not really understanding that they're moving to and through racism, but just living their ordinary lives and contributing to racism by their benign inaction. So I'm going to build on this story, get back on the conveyor belt over here, to help us know how can we act. So here we are on this crowded conveyor belt, and we're just living our lives, most of us not even paying attention or even wondering where we're going. But say one of us looks up and we see racism. Well, one reaction is to close your eyes. That's denial, right? Or another reaction is to turn around. You're still going in the same direction. Maybe you're colorblind. But if we do not, and you know what that shows you? That shows you that racism is most often passive. Most often shows up as inaction in the face of need. But if we're on this conveyor belt and we don't want to go there, then what we have to do is start walking backwards, right? And we need to walk at least as fast as it's going, not to go that way. But now we have to start walking faster if we don't want to. We really want to get away from that. And what happens when you start walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You bump into people and they say, hey buddy, watch out. Where are you going? And this is your opportunity to do the first of 3 steps in terms of being actively anti-racist, and that is to name racism. You say, look, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? And most people will say, just stop bothering me. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn around with you. So now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards on this conveyor belt. And now where are you headed? You're not just going away from racism, but now you're actually going to understand the conveyor belt motor. And now you're going to do the second of the 3 stages of anti-racism, which is to ask, how is racism operating here? And so maybe one of you thinks it's a lever, and you pick the lever up, and the belt jolts because the lever is part of it. But it's a very smart conveyor belt, so whoop, it reconfigures itself and keeps going. So now you have to do the third thing to be actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act with others who are on the other side, trying this dial or trying this button. And I believe that we together can dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all of us can know our full potential and have the opportunity to develop to our full potential.
Let's talk about racism. This video is going to be a crash course on racism, critical race theory, and anti-racism, including the 6 basic tenets of CRT, and the 5 actions associated with anti-racism, and also answering the question, what's the difference between CRT and anti-racism? So what is racism? I like this definition by Harrell. A system of dominance, power, and privilege based on racial group designations, rooted in the historical oppression of a group defined as, or perceived by dominant group members as inferior, deviant, or undesirable, and occurring in circumstances where members of the dominant group create or accept their societal privilege by maintaining structures, ideology, values, and behavior that have the intent or the effect of leaving non-dominant group members relatively excluded from power, esteem, status, and or equal access to societal resources. So what is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a movement made up of a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and changing the relationship between race, racism, and power. CRT is an academic framework. It's a lens for analyzing how race and power operate in society. CRT attempts to understand how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, and use that understanding to transform society for the better. Critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries to both understand and also change our social situation. So in summary, CRT aims to understand, challenge, and dismantle systems of oppression. It's not just about understanding racism, but also about working towards a more just and equitable society. It's important to note, unlike some forms of civil rights discourse, which stress incrementalism and step-by-step progress, CRT questions the very foundations of the system and aims to challenge and dismantle systems of oppression. Critical race theory first developed in the 1970s as a number of lawyers, activists, and legal scholars across the country realized, more or less simultaneously, that the advances of the civil rights era of the 1960s had stalled. In many respects, they had been rolled back. Similar to today, these scholars realized that new theories and strategies were needed to combat the subtler forms of racism that were gaining ground. There are 6 basic tenets of critical race theory. The first tenet is that racism is ordinary. This means that racism operates in the usual way society does business, the common and everyday experiences of most people of color in the country. Racism is systemic. CRT views racism as embedded within institutions and laws, not just the result of individual prejudices. It argues that racism is a normal feature of society, operating even in the absence of overt racial intent. The systemic nature of racism perpetuates inequality, even when individuals aren't consciously discriminating. This also makes racism difficult to address because it can be commonly not recognized or acknowledged. For example, I'm a psychiatrist working in New York. At the hospital where I work, and at every other hospital I've ever worked, I've always been one of the very few Black doctors. This is so prevalent in the US that it's considered normal. However, compared to my family's ancestral home, the Bahamas, it's quite common for doctors, lawyers, Supreme Court justices, everyone in every profession and every part of society to be Black. Black and Latina doctors being underrepresented in the United States is so common to be considered normal here, when in actuality, it's not normal, not right, and is the legacy of systemic racism. The second feature, interest convergence, or material determinism, is the idea that our system of white over color hierarchy serves important purposes, both socially and financially, for the dominant group. Because racism advances the interests of elite white communities through finances and resources, but also of working class white communities through social clout, large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate it. The concept of interest convergence suggests that racial progress often occurs only when it benefits the dominant group. In other words, policies aimed at racial equality are more likely to be enacted when they also serve the interests of white communities. An example of this is in the United States, when working-class MAGA voters vote against their own financial interests in support of a president who helps billionaires consolidate more of the country's collective wealth, for the consolation prize of feeling a little bit better about themselves by collectively scapegoating the most marginalized in society. The fourth feature of CRT is the recognition that race is a social construct. CRT argues that race is not a biological reality, but a social invention. It's a system of categorization created to establish and maintain power hierarchies. While there are obvious physical differences between people, the meanings and significance attached to these differences are socially constructed. Race may not be biologically real, but it's still socially real and has real-world social implications on the lives of those from oppressed racial and ethnic communities. The fourth feature of CRT is the concept of differential racialization. Differential racialization refers to the idea that each race has its own origins and ever-evolving history, and that the dominant society racializes different minority groups at different times. For example, take Dr. Seuss. He perpetuated harmful Asian stereotypes in a series of political cartoons. From 1941 to 1943, he published more than 400 cartoons for the New York newspaper PM, many of which displayed anti-Japanese racism during World War II. One of his most infamous political cartoons suggested that Japanese Americans were a threat to the US after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Titled, "Waiting for the Signal from Home," the cartoon depicts countless characters with the same slanted eyes and glasses, who are meant to be Japanese Americans, marching along the West Coast and waiting to pick up explosives from a store labeled Honorable Fifth Column. The cartoon was published on February 13, 1942, just 6 days before President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which led to the incarceration of more than 110,000 individuals of Japanese descent. Members of Southeast Asian communities experienced increased overt racism in the aftermath of 9/11, whereas members of East Asian communities experienced increased overt racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Closely related to differential racialization is the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. No person has a single, easily stated, unitary identity, but rather each of us has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. Intersectionality recognizes that people experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. Intersectionality examines how race interacts with other identities, such as gender, class, and sexual orientation, to create unique experiences of both advantage and also unique experiences of disadvantage. One example of racism and sexism operating intersectionally is the concept of misogynoir. Misogynoir is the specific hatred, prejudice, or discrimination directed against Black women. It's a unique form of misogyny that combines sexism and racism, recognizing that Black women experience discrimination that is distinct from that faced by other women. A final concept is the notion of a unique voice of color. This centers on lived experience of people of color. Because of our different histories and experiences with oppression, those of us from Black, Indigenous, AAPI, and Latina communities may be able to communicate points of view that they may not have considered and are unlikely to know. CRT argues that those of us who have experienced racism firsthand offer crucial insights into its operation and impact. Critical race theory is evolving. It's an ongoing intellectual project with diverse perspectives and approaches. Understanding these basic tenets can help us grasp the core ideas of critical race theory and how it analyzes the role of race in society. It's important to note, CRT has been a controversial topic, with some misrepresenting its meaning and purpose. However, understanding the connection between anti-racism and CRT is crucial for effectively combating racism and working towards a more just society. CRT is not about blaming individuals, and it's not about making white people feel guilty about their race. It focuses on systemic issues to understand and help dismantle racism. What is anti-racism? Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and opposing racism. It requires conscious effort and action to combat racism in all of its forms. Key principles of anti-racism include acknowledging racism exists. Anti-racism starts with recognizing that racism is a systemic problem embedded in institutions and individuals. It's not just about overt prejudice, but also about more subtle biases and unequal power structures. Taking responsibility. Anti-racism requires each of us to examine our own biases and complicity in upholding racist systems. It's about actively challenging not only the racist ideas and behaviors of others, but also within ourselves. Working towards change. Anti-racism involves taking action to dismantle racist systems and create a more equitable society. This can include advocating for policy changes, supporting anti-racist organizations, and educating oneself and others about racism. So what are 5 action steps of anti-racism? Number 1, educating ourselves. Learning about the history of racism, how it operates in society, and the experiences of various marginalized groups. Number 2, speaking up. Challenging racist jokes, stereotypes, and discriminatory behavior when we encounter them. Number 3, supporting anti-racist organizations. Donating or volunteering with groups working to combat racism and promote racial justice. Number 4, advocating for policy changes. Supporting legislation that addresses racial inequality in areas like education, housing, and criminal justice. How we vote matters. And number 5, amplifying marginalized voices. Making space for and listening to the perspectives of people from marginalized communities. This includes those of us from marginalized communities ourselves, and everyone pursuing allyship with those from other oppressed communities. It's important to remember that anti-racism is ongoing work. It's a continuous process of learning, unlearning, and taking action. There's no endpoint, but rather a commitment to constantly striving for a more just world. Anti-racism is uncomfortable. It requires challenging our own beliefs and confronting uncomfortable truths about society. But this discomfort is necessary for growth and change. And anti-racism is for everyone. People of all backgrounds can and should be involved in anti-racism. It's about working together to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. So how does critical race theory and anti-racism relate? CRT informs anti-racism. CRT provides a theoretical foundation for understanding how racism functions, which helps to inform anti-racist actions. By understanding the systemic nature of racism, anti-racism efforts can be more targeted and effective. Anti-racism puts CRT into practice. While CRT is primarily an analytical tool, anti-racism takes those analyses and translates them to concrete actions to combat racism. Let's think of it another way. Imagine you're trying to fix a leaky faucet. Anti-racism is like the act of actually fixing the faucet, tightening the pipes, replacing the washers. CRT is like understanding the plumbing system, how the water pressure works, where the pipes are located, and why the leak occurred in the first place. You need both to effectively solve the problem. So what are your initial reflections? Did anything you hear stand out or make you think or bring up any questions? Please add any thoughts in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, watch the next video. Much thanks for joining. Be well.